We can be the good guys, or we can be the guys that save the world. A line that goes so incredibly hard, I can only think of one or two that match it. And I'll circle back around to that line, because how could I not? But to quickly summarize what I interpreted, when it comes to saving the world, or saving lives in general, do you use logic or morality? Is it even possible to save the world using morality alone? Or is the logic of the greater good more necessary? In today's video, I not only want to get to the bottom of that ethical dilemma, but I also want to highlight a few instances of how the get ready for a $5 word juxtaposition of events, themes, and characters, as well as just the phenomenal writing about, get ready for another $5 word, utilitarianism throughout, has shot this show's stardom into the stratosphere. Although when I think about it, I haven't seen nearly enough love for the writing in Invincible. Everyone's been hating on its animation, something that does sadly overshadow everything else in an inescapable way, because it does range from genuinely great to pretty okay to really not good. But that shouldn't take away from the show continuously proving how intelligent and forward-thinking the writing is, particularly when it comes to specific comparisons that can be drawn from one finale to the next, from one character to another, and even an arc from the comic that hasn't been adapted yet. Welcome to Sandwich Reviews. I'm the Talking Sentient Sandwich, your nihilistic optimist, and now that enough time has passed for Season 3 to kick off and for people to entirely forget about everything before it, let's talk about how good it was. And obviously, I'll give you specific warnings when they come up, but spoilers. But let's start out with the most stark comparison, and what made me think of writing this video in the first place. That being how Mark lost the season finale fight with his dad, yet technically won the battle, and in the next season finale, defeated Angstrom Levy in their fight, while technically losing the battle. And that requires a lot of explaining, which I will get to, but for me, that initial thought didn't just make the whole of season 2 better retroactively, but it was something that, in the moment, made me think that the whole story was better than the season 1 climax. Though I have since gone back and found that is not the case. And I am thankful that I did go back and rewatch a lot of this, because I'd planned to make this video long ago, right after season 2 aired, since I was covering it on my channel. But over time, I've thought of so many other relative similarities and differences between the themes and characters we've gotten in Invincible, that contrast against each other in such thematically brilliant ways, and set up for dozens of stories in the future, that I am eternally grateful that I waited. Because all of those details have rattled around my brain for almost a year, and I'm more than ready to dive in. But before I expand out and dive into every facet of this first comparison, let me summarize the two finales, just to make sure everyone's up to speed. If you found this video, you've definitely seen them, but you never know. And season 1 ends as climactically as ever, with the whole season leading up to Omni-Man revealing why he killed the Guardians of the Globe, and subsequently attempting to begin his actual invasion of Earth, after decades of preparation. And this finale was perfect on so many levels, but mainly just because it was so damn ambiguous, something that the show and comic in general excels at, but is put on display at the end of season 1. And Nolan's Omni-Man is later revealed to be unsure of what he actually wants, but in this finale, he is shown to be purposefully crashing into as many buildings and boats as he can, killing so many lives and almost proving to himself more than anyone else that he does in fact believe in what he is saying. And in that, Mark isn't a physical match for his father in the slightest, kinda just getting swatted around helplessly the entire time, though that is a staple of the titular character for almost half of the entire comic. But seriously, Mark gets his ass beat in 3 different time zones. Yet if you look just a bit deeper, as a battle of wills, he undeniably wins against his dad. And that's all because Mark isn't willing to give up on his ideals, and decides to stand up to his father again and again, even though he is proven to not be strong enough at every turn. And just after a few instances of that, Nolan gives up. And I won't highlight the "what will you have after 500 years" line, because that's not important yet. But the way that Mark, with his teeth knocked out to look like his childhood self for a solid gut punch, and adding a bit of juxtaposition, is able to talk his father down with the truth that they're both more human than they realize. And it's all so heartbreakingly masterful, it hurts. And then, if that wasn't good enough, the next season steps it up with the multiverse traveling villain. And though the climax for season 2 isn't as condensed to perfection or singular as the first, it really is just as impactful to the overall Invincible story. I'd say more than the first, but then again, there's the 500 years line. but season 2 ends in a thrilling battle between Angstrom Levy and Mark. And unlike the last season, Mark is clearly more powerful than Levy, the problem being that he just can't reach him, and he is tricked into getting stuck in a new dimension time and time again. And this allows for some spectacular cameos that are legally distinct enough from the well-known heroes they definitely aren't, but what this really does is ramp up the tension every time it cuts back to the danger Debbie and Oliver were in, all the while getting the audience to wish more than anything that Mark could get to Levy and stop his madness. Once Mark finally outsmarts him, he and Levy have a battle where both get a little heated. And like I already said, Mark defeats Angstrom, but Angstrom wins. A, proving that Mark was a killer and forcing him to reconcile with that, and B, stranding him on a deserted planet to die. Part of me wishes, even when I first read the story years ago, that Mark spent just a little longer wallowing in his own self-pity, but the ex machina of the future teen team coming to save him does manage to set up a lot, so I'm willing to give it a pass. Besides, in the meantime before then, Mark had plenty of time to crash out and then some. I don't want to dive into the future comic spoilers, but Mark killing irredeemable villains for the greater good is a massive theme of the overarching story. And this is the point where I truly want to dive into the ethical debate I brushed over in the beginning, because when it comes to superheroes living in a fictional universe with similar politics to our own, albeit exaggerated, it's not hard to discern Robert Kirkman's philosophy, where the ambiguous evils of the greater good can typically be seen as a necessary evil. Mark may not want to kill anyone, but he ends up stopping Levy for good. And it was in a blind rage, but it happens nonetheless, and Mark is forced to dwell with the fact that what he did was objectively a good thing. Sure, there's always the argument of second chances, which is another big theme of Invincible, with villains becoming heroes and heroes becoming villains all the time, but that's a concept that has only ever worked in rare cases like with Batman. Superhero stories are often tasked with the impossible feat of proving the value of human life, something that should be an intrinsic fact, and maybe it's just because I'm a nihilist most of the time, but to me, isn't. And the utilitarian themes brought up in Invincible have an inherently easier time proving that. And that doesn't necessarily have to go against the idea of upholding human life. It just means that the writing in Invincible often demonstrates the advantages and the perils of focusing on the happiness and health of the greater good while maintaining the least amount of harm, the literal definition of utilitarianism. Considering how much power Mark and all of the other powered individuals in the Invincible story possess, the question has to be asked: why is hunger and poverty still a thing? Why are there still problems at all? The reason why is because those who could step in to completely eliminate problems like that won't. Because those problems are infinitely more complex than just going in and fixing them, but also because as soon as they overstep into that territory, there isn't much difference between that and being a fascist dictator. I mean, there's lots of evil steps required to fully step into that role, but it's still something that Anissa brings up perfectly in season 2. How a Viltrumite occupation would end up with tons of harm, but could possibly end up with the greatest good as a long-run outcome. It's quite a stretch to believe that a heroic individual would bring themselves to something as horrifically terrible as ruling the world with malicious force, a joke made in episode 4 of season 3 about Mark and Eve. But it's not entirely unbelievable for someone in their position to make subsequently taxing decisions, each more stress-inducing than the last, and being crushed under the weight of it. And that kind of exhaustion is understandable because we experience a fraction of it in our daily lives. Some people more substantially than others, but we all feel that ethical pressure to do right. At least I hope you do, because if you don't, then you might be a psychopath. But for your average bear, it weighs on you, as it should, because we should all be thinking about the good that can be done with any little power that we have. Do we? Yeah, unimportant. But now, slightly transitioning, but still staying on the topic of utilitarianism, I want to bring up what we've gotten from Season 3, which at time of recording is only up to Episode 5, but Episode 4 is really where Mark's journey of killing for the greater good actually starts. The argument could be made that it was also killing dozens of multi-Pauls, or in Episode 2, where he brutally wrecks some Animan in a manner that wasn't unfamiliar to Omni-Man killing the Guardians of the Globe. But in Episode 4, once it becomes the only option left on the table, Mark rips the head off of a future version of Immortal who has become jaded after centuries of loneliness. And it being the only option typically isn't the case, with so many more moving pieces and morally ambiguous aspects in the real world, let alone Mark's actual time, but Having this centuries-old version of Immortal was the ideal way to demonstrate how killing the bad guy doesn't have to be an evil act. Mark, of course, only acts to save others, but he's still sad, because what he did was ethically wrong. Yet, Fightmaster and Dropkick thank him for it, because it was, from a utilitarian point of view, more than justified. The reason why I mentioned earlier that when he beat Angstrom, it could be viewed as objectively good. Honestly, it's hard to bring up any of these ethical debates for this episode because Immortal was asking for Mark to kill him, diluting the message of necessary evils, but the point still stands. And if we move on to an earlier example from Season 3, we can see how the show uses just about every chance they can to further develop that idea. If I had to think of one downside to the new season, and this is something that I'll talk about in my inevitable review, it's the power scaling. Despite this having not much to do with the themes, it is distracting when all you want is to see Invincible win a fight, and not an easy one, an actual fight. Though it's not actually that bad because Mark has and will only ever be as strong as he needs to be to create the most drama and tension in a given situation, as all superheroes do. Trust me, you'll lose your mind trying to match and rank the power levels of different characters, questioning how the N-Men could beat the subterranean bugs while Mark couldn't, and then 10 minutes later Mark is beating the N-Men. Does that make sense if you dissect it with a fine-tooth comb? Not really, but every logical flaw seen is also there by design. Season 3 starts out with Mark having increased his strength by 130%, and that alone creates the expectation that Invincible is going to be kicking all kinds of ass. So when the first episode ends with a perfect scenario to have Invincible save everyone and be the Earth's undeniable hero, it's disappointing when he doesn't. A lesser show would've, but they didn't. That's also there to set up one of the best conflicts in the show, period. And notice how I said one of, because there's still plenty more good stuff to come. But the juxtaposition of Cecil and Mark is quite possibly my favorite thing yet. The simple comparison of Cecil wanting to control Mark and Mark wanting to control Oliver is almost too perfect. How Mark quickly got frustrated with Oliver immediately wanting to jump in and save people, which reminded me of a certain hero jumping in headfirst to problems he was in over his head for in Season 1. Or how Cecil shot the two reformed bad guys in his backstory, holding the exact same opinion Mark had in the present day. My mind immediately wants to bring up another pair of characters who are on the same path, but months apart, and I not only don't want to spoil it, since that'll be adapted soon enough, but I also don't want to add more fuel to a comment section that will already be filled with plenty of political discourse. Yet if you know, you know. Because if there's one thing that I know I love, it's diametrically opposed characters going on the same thematic journey. But, as with every other detail within this show, there's also the utilitarian side of it, upholding just about everything I talked about before and hammering it home even further, because it's at this point where the show diverges from the general themes of utilitarianism to dissecting the specific contradictions seen in most pragmatic mindsets, that being that most will either prioritize saving people or prioritize identifying the bad ones and stopping them from hurting others. In a perfect world, it's more than possible to save people and stop them from being hurt. Superman is one of my favorite characters out there because he does both and his stories center around that idea. But Invincible isn't about that. Invincible asks the question of what's more important. For the conflict between Cecil and Mark, it's the superhero who wants to prioritize putting the bad guys away, focusing on the potential danger they pose. A pessimistic viewpoint, but one that Mark is more than fair to have. He might be a hypocrite for not holding those same views when it comes to Omni-Man, but it's that ambiguous complexity that makes Mark feel that he needs to crack down on Cecil, thinking that if he solved enough domestic problems, it might tip the scales toward balance. Cecil, on the other hand, just wants to save as many lives as possible, by any means necessary, and personally, I think Cecil is right. If someone is capable of doing good and saving lives, there is no reason they shouldn't be given that chance. A supervised second chance, with lots of precautions, because no one's that naive, but a second chance nonetheless. But maybe Cecil's side is easier to see just because the writers clearly think so too. Although even if you don't agree with him, you should at least be able to understand exactly why Cecil did what he did. Another reason why the writing in this show is great. There are other characters expanded upon in Season 3, but one that toes the line of that understanding is Oliver, who gets annoying in a spoiled brat kind of way, which mostly comes down to the remorseless killing, but before then, he's 100% correct about how people with power should stop others from being hurt. I mean, there was him kinda siding with his dad, which isn't the best sign for him, but he redeems himself later on in the season by pantsing some bullies. But finally, let's move on to the last point of discussion, and I probably could have been better at giving spoiler warnings throughout, but from here until the end, massive comic spoilers. If you haven't read it and don't want me to ruin it, please pause the video now. Honestly, it's not anything too major, but still, you have been warned. But the one guy I couldn't help but bring up is Dinosaurus, the peak of Invincible's utilitarian, greater good conversation, and I'm hoping he'll be introduced soon, since he's brought in right after the Invincible War in issue 68 of the comic, and aside from him being incredibly dangerous, he is one of the smartest problem-solving minds on the planet, the only issue being how cold-hearted he is, not necessarily wanting to kill, but doing it without hesitation if need be. One example being how he blows up Las Vegas and uses it for solar power, though it's still not the best example because Dinosaurus makes sure everyone is out of the blast radius beforehand. It's just the first example I could think of, but it's right after that happens that Invincible realizes the good that can be done if he just acts and actually does something proactive, rather than just constantly reacting, which is what superheroes often get stuck doing. But to wrap up, should Invincible step in where he can, or would that be considered ruling? Drop a comment and let me know. And as always, thanks for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe for weekly video essays and reviews, and enjoy a delicious sandwich.